This isn't just another story. It's a battle, a spectacle, a moment where the world holds its breath. The courtroom is packed, the press is waiting, and the tension? Unbreakable. But before we dive into this high-stakes trial, I need you to be the jury of this channel. Hit that like button if you're ready for the truth. Comment your verdict below, and most importantly, subscribe so you don't miss the twists that are about to unfold. The gavel has dropped, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The courtroom was a battlefield long before Barron Trump even arrived. Outside, a media frenzy had been building for days, with journalists, photographers, and reporters scrambling to capture any detail they could. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, broadcasting live updates to an audience eager for every development. Headlines speculated wildly, some declaring his guilt before the trial had even begun, others questioning the integrity of the case itself. Inside the courtroom, the chaos continued. Every available seat in the gallery was filled, journalists gripping their notepads, cameras clicking discreetly as Barron stepped in. The air was thick with whispered conversations, hushed analyses of his every movement. Some saw a young man caught in a storm beyond his control. Others saw the privileged son of a controversial figure finally facing justice. The jury sat stiffly, eyes shifting between Barron and the prosecution. Judge Lionel Mercer loomed over the room, his expression unreadable, though his reputation left little doubt about where he stood. The atmosphere was charged. This wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle. Everyone in the room knew it. Barron Trump wasn't just fighting for his innocence. He was fighting against the weight of public perception. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension, a silent force pressing down on everyone present. The room was already charged before Barron Trump even stepped inside. But the moment he did, the weight of expectation seemed to double. All eyes turned to him, some with curiosity, others with disdain. The journalists, crammed into every available space, gripped their notepads tightly, their cameras clicking discreetly. The jury sat stiffly, watching his every move, their expressions unreadable. At the front of the room sat Judge Lionel Mercer, a man whose reputation preceded him. He was known for his sharp tongue, his ruthless handling of high-profile cases, and, most importantly, his complete intolerance for entitlement. To him, wealth and privilege were not shields but weaknesses to be exposed. He had built his career dismantling those who, in his words, had been born into an easy life. His rulings were infamous, his demeanor unwavering. If someone like Barron Trump expected special treatment in his courtroom, he was about to be sorely mistaken. The moment Barron crossed the threshold, Mercer's lips curled ever so slightly, not in a smile, but in something more sinister. A smirk, a quiet message that needed no words. "You don't belong here, and I will make sure you know it." It was a small flicker of expression, one that disappeared almost as soon as it appeared, but it was enough. Enough for Barron to understand exactly what kind of trial this would be. This wasn't just about the law, it was about humiliation. It was about putting the Trump name on trial, not just Barron himself. And yet Barron didn't flinch. He walked forward with controlled confidence, his posture straight, his expression calm. He had known this moment would come, had spent years preparing for it, not just in courtrooms, but in the public eye, where every move was scrutinized. He had learned long ago that showing emotion, showing weakness, was exactly what his critics wanted. So he gave them nothing. As he took his seat, his attorney, Daniel Hayward, leaned in close and muttered, "Stay quiet. Let them talk first. We'll strike when it's time." Barron only gave the slightest nod in response. He didn't need to say anything. His heart was steady, his breathing controlled. He had been in rooms before where people wanted him to fail, wanted to see him fall. This wouldn't be the last time. Judge Mercer shuffled the papers in front of him, deliberately dragging out the moment. He adjusted his glasses, looked up at Barron, and let the silence stretch before speaking. When he finally did, his voice was loud, meant for the jury to hear. "Well, well," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's not every day a Trump sits in my courtroom. I imagine you're used to things going your way, huh?" A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Some jurors exchanged glances. Barron didn't move. Mercer leaned forward slightly, his smirk deepening. You do understand that this is not a reality show, don't you? This isn't about branding or business deals. This is a real courtroom with real consequences. More murmurs, more knowing smirks from the prosecution side. Barron simply met Mercer's gaze, his voice measured and unshaken when he finally spoke. I understand perfectly, Your Honor. For just a fraction of a second, Mercer's smirk faltered. Just a flicker. And then it was gone. He straightened in his chair, clearing his throat. Good, he said, because your name won't save you here. And with that, Barron Trump knew exactly what kind of fight this would be. The courtroom was tense as Evelyn Grant rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and poised. She was no ordinary prosecutor. She was known for her relentless, razor-sharp approach, a woman who dismantled witnesses with surgical precision. As she walked toward the center of the courtroom, she didn't immediately face Barron Trump. Instead, she turned to the jury, always the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady, carrying the weight of rehearsed confidence. This case is not just about Barron Trump. It is about accountability. It is about fairness. And most importantly, it is about justice. She paused, letting the words sink in. Then slowly she turned, her gaze settling on Barron for just a second too long. Just enough to make a statement without saying anything at all. Barron didn't react, his expression unreadable. For too long, she continued, we have allowed privilege to dictate consequences. We have seen powerful men walk free while ordinary citizens pay the price for their mistakes. But today, she let the silence stretch, the weight of anticipation thicken the room. Today, we prove that the law applies to everyone, even to him. She pointed at Barron, her gesture controlled but theatrical enough to draw attention. Some members of the jury shifted slightly in their seats, leaning forward. The journalists in the gallery scribbled notes furiously, sensing the weight of the moment. Grant moved methodically as she built her case, detailing a web of financial misconduct that she claimed had been orchestrated under Barron's name. Throughout this trial, she continued, you will hear about financial transactions that suggest deceit. You will hear testimonies from people who once trusted the defendant, only to be left betrayed. And most importantly, you will see evidence that cannot be ignored. She walked back toward the prosecution's table, her heels clicking sharply against the polished courtroom floor. There was no rush, no hint of uncertainty. She exuded control. Turning back to the jury, she added, the defense will try to convince you that this case is about revenge, that my team and I are here for a spectacle. But I ask you, if this were any other man, if this were not a Trump, would we even be having this conversation? A murmur rippled through the room. The impact of her words was undeniable. She had skillfully framed the case as a moral reckoning, a moment for the justice system to prove it wasn't influenced by power or wealth. She nodded toward Judge Mercer. The prosecution is ready to proceed, Your Honor. Mercer gave a small nod, acknowledging her. The courtroom held its breath for a beat, then shifted its focus. Barron Trump remained still, his expression unreadable. But he knew one thing. Evelyn Grant had just set the stage for a battle that was only beginning. As Evelyn Grant returned to her seat, the energy in the courtroom was charged. She had delivered a powerful opening, weaving a narrative of accountability, fairness, and justice. But Daniel Hayward was not rattled. He remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, exuding a quiet confidence that made the jury subconsciously lean in. Then with deliberate ease, he stood. Hayward was not a man of theatrics. Unlike Grant, who thrived on grand gestures and cutting rhetoric, he was measured, controlled. He didn't need to make a show of his argument. His words would be enough. Your Honor, he began, folding his hands behind his back, his voice even and steady. The defense does not dispute that Barron Trump is his father's son, nor do we dispute that privilege exists in this country. He let the admission settle, giving the jury a moment to digest it. Some members exchanged quick glances, caught off guard by his directness. But what we will prove, Hayward continued, his tone firm, is that this case is not about justice, it is about revenge. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Even Judge Mercer's gaze darkened slightly at the claim, but Hayward remained unfazed. He had expected resistance. From the moment my client's name was mentioned in connection with this case, the media was handed a narrative, he said, turning slightly to address the jury. A villain, the son of a controversial president, a man with a last name that half the country loves and the other half despises. He gestured subtly toward the prosecution. The evidence they will present will not be built on facts, but on assumptions. You will hear testimony that sounds convenient, but upon closer inspection, will be riddled with inconsistencies. They will tell you a story, a compelling one, no doubt, but a story nonetheless. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, the prosecution side shifted ever so slightly. The jurors were listening, and more importantly, they were thinking. Hayward took a slow step toward Judge Mercer, his expression neutral, but his words sharp. And most importantly, he continued, we will expose the bias that has already infected this courtroom. A sharp intake of breath from the gallery. The press took note. Judge Mercer's lips tightened, his hands pressing slightly firmer against the bench. He did not appreciate the accusation, but Hayward had not broken eye contact. He wasn't speaking recklessly. He was making a calculated move. The tension in the room thickened, but Hayward remained composed. At the end of this trial, the question you must answer is not whether Barron Trump comes from wealth. It is not whether he carries a famous name. The only question that matters is whether the prosecution has proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he is guilty of the crimes they claim. He turned back to the jury. And I assure you, they will not. With that, he nodded. The defense is ready to proceed, Your Honor. The battle had truly begun. The prosecution wasted no time. Their first witness was a financial expert, Mr. Aldridge, called to the stand to analyze Barron Trump's alleged role in a mismanaged investment fund. Evelyn Grant moved with precision, confident in her approach. She knew this was her moment to lay the foundation of her case. She stepped forward, her voice sharp yet controlled. Mr. Aldridge, can you confirm that there were significant financial inconsistencies in the fund associated with Mr. Trump? The financial analyst nodded. Yes, there were large sums moved without proper documentation. Funds were transferred between multiple accounts, some of which were difficult to trace. Grant turned slightly, just enough to glance at Barron before continuing. And would someone with access to those accounts need specific authorization? Yes. And who had that authorization? The analyst didn't hesitate. Barron Trump. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was a damning claim, one that Grant let linger in the air before moving back to her seat. The prosecution was building momentum, and she knew it. But then Daniel Hayward stood. His approach was different, calm, methodical. He walked toward the witness stand with deliberate ease, addressing Mr. Aldridge in an even tone. Mr. Aldridge, Hayward began, is it true that you never personally saw Barron Trump execute a single transaction? The analyst hesitated, just for a moment before answering. Well, just yes or no? No. The first crack in the prosecution's case. Hayward's gaze remained steady as he pressed further. And isn't it also true that these transactions occurred during a period when my client was out of the country? A longer pause. The hesitation was noticeable. Then reluctantly, the analyst answered, yes. The jury was listening now. Grant shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Even Judge Mercer frowned slightly. The momentum had shifted. But just as Barron started to feel the tide turning, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A new witness entered. A man Barron never expected to see. His former best friend, David Walsh. The air in the room thickened as David walked toward the witness stand, his pace measured, his eyes darting around before landing on Barron. For the briefest second, there was hesitation, maybe even regret. But then it was gone. Judge Mercer adjusted his glasses, looking toward the prosecution. I wasn't aware we had an additional witness. Ms. Grant gave a small, polite smile. Your Honor, Mr. Walsh was added last minute due to new developments in the case. We believe his testimony will be highly relevant. Mercer eyed her for a moment, then sighed. Proceed. Grant approached David, her heels clicking against the floor. Mr. Walsh, for the record, can you confirm your prior relationship with the defendant? David cleared his throat. Yeah, we were friends. A pause, then softer. We haven't spoken in a while. I imagine that's been difficult, Grant said, her tone carefully sympathetic. Would you say you once trusted Mr. Trump? David shifted. Yeah, I did. And when did that trust begin to change? David hesitated. Barron could see it, the way his friend's jaw tensed, his fingers curling slightly around the railing of the stand. He was nervous. After I started seeing things that didn't add up, David finally said. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Grant feigned concern. Could you elaborate, Mr. Walsh? David exhaled. There were money transfers. A lot of them. I worked on some of Barron's projects, and at first everything seemed fine. But then money started moving around in ways that didn't make sense. I asked about it, and he told me not to worry. Barron clenched his fist beneath the table. That was not what had happened. Grant seized the moment. And did that concern you? David nodded. Yeah, it did. Did you ever personally witness Mr. Trump authorizing these transactions? David hesitated again. The moment stretched. If he said yes, it would be a direct accusation. If he said no, the prosecution's case would begin to crack. Then, before he could finish, Hayward was already on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Leading the witness. Mercer frowned but waved a hand. Sustained. Mr. Walsh, answer carefully. David swallowed. I didn't see him do it personally, but he was the only one with access. Another murmur ran through the courtroom. Grant smiled. She knew she had won this round, but Barron knew the truth. He knew why David was here. His former best friend had been offered something. Immunity, maybe a deal to distance himself from the case at Barron's expense. And worst of all, David had taken it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Daniel Hayward stood and calmly announced that the defense was calling Barron Trump to the stand. Defendants in high-profile cases rarely testified. It was too risky, too unpredictable. The press went wild, journalists scrambling to record the moment. Evelyn Grant stiffened slightly, her polished confidence flickering for just a second. This was unexpected. Barron stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the witness stand with quiet control. He carried himself with a composure that even seasoned politicians struggled to master. As he raised his hand and took the oath, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. This was it, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Hayward stepped forward, his approach measured. Mr. Trump, he began, I know this is unusual, but I want the jury to hear it from you directly. Did you ever at any point authorize fraudulent transactions? Barron's voice was steady. No, I did not. Hayward nodded. Were you aware of any misconduct happening under your name? No. Did you personally benefit in any way from these alleged actions? Again, Barron didn't hesitate. No, I did not. There was a silence, heavy and deliberate. The prosecution had spent hours painting Barron as an entitled figure, a man hiding behind wealth and influence. But now faced with his direct responses, firm, unshaken, and honest, the jury was forced to reconsider. Hayward turned toward them. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard hours of testimony. You've seen documents, accounts, expert opinions. But at the end of the day, this case comes down to one thing, a story. The prosecution has told you a compelling story about a privileged man abusing power, assuming that guilt comes with his last name. He turned back to Barron. Tell me, Mr. Trump, has your last name protected you? Barron exhaled. No. Not a single sound came from the jury. Not a murmur from the gallery. Barron continued, his voice controlled. My last name has put a target on my back since I was a child. It has made people assume things about me before I even spoke. It has put me in rooms like this, accused of things I didn't do, just because people wanted someone to blame. For the first time, Evelyn Grant stopped flipping through her notes. She was listening. The jury was watching closely. The cracks in the prosecution's case were growing. When it was Grant's turn to cross-examine, she walked toward Barron with careful calculation. Mr. Trump, you say your name has made your life difficult, and yet wouldn't you also say that your name has granted you advantages that others don't have? Barron didn't hesitate. Absolutely. A few whispers in the audience. Grant raised an eyebrow. You don't deny it. No, Barron said firmly. I've had privilege. I've had opportunities that others haven't. But that's not what this case is about. The question isn't whether I come from money. It's whether I committed a crime. Grant's jaw tightened slightly. So you admit to being privileged, but you want the jury to believe that you've never used that privilege to your advantage? Barron met her gaze unwavering. I want the jury to believe the facts. The jury was engaged, no longer passive observers, but active participants in the case. Some members sat forward, their initial skepticism replaced with something more dangerous to the prosecution: doubt. Judge Mercer, who had spent days subtly mocking Barron, was watching differently now. The smugness was gone. He rubbed his temples as if only now realizing that this trial was no longer just about a name. It was about whether justice was truly being served. When the recess was called, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The trial had started as a spectacle, a public reckoning for a famous last name. But now it was something else entirely.